everyone, my name is INès FRAZIER. I'm based in Houston, Texas, and I'm currently doing a lot of work within the regenerative agriculture side. I work for a nonprofit called Farmers Footprint, where we focus on regenerating land and healing people on the planet through catalyzing a regenerative future. And I also work on a small urban farm here in Houston, Texas, where we do food mutual aid, providing local community that doesn't have a grocery store food as much as possible based off of our current expansion and resources that we have at hand. And I also do a lot of beekeeping and focus on connecting with those in my community here in Houston when I have the chance to, outside of all the other busy things that I'm doing. I got involved with MESA through WOOF, which is Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. They provided a 6-week grant program for the past summer that I participated in, and throughout those weeks, MESA offered us a 2 touch point class where twice a week for 4 weeks, we engaged as a group and had a leader as a mentor who walked us through the agroecological flower, kind of going through the basis and introduction to agroecology, which was really cool to kind of get the baseline as to how it got started, what we're learning, and how that kind of comes into focus within all of the other goodness that's happening in the world. And that project inspired me to continue doing the work that I'm doing through food sovereignty. I did my undergraduate research in racism and agriculture, so I've been a huge proponent as to focusing all of the work that I do on providing resources to predominantly Black and Indigenous communities here in Houston and abroad wherever I can. If you are interested in learning more about regenerative agriculture, my nonprofit focuses on storytelling, on how we can provide that resources to farmers and other people alike, and just getting that knowledge out to consumers and how they can provide resources or even just have that knowledge imparted on them, and having more of the reciprocity and gratitude for the hands that touch the food that end up in our mouths 3 times a day. We're talking about Metapopulations today as a alumni of the TAAP program, Training in Applied Agroecology, through WOOF USA, Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, as an understory program within MESA, Multinational Exchange in Sustainable Agriculture. Intro to Metapopulations, a population of populations, which is not related to Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook, now Meta, but defined as a population of populations, which can sort of be thought of as Facebook groups, but not exactly. So we'll kind of dive into what are some of the assumptions of this approach, which are metapopulations are comprised of discrete subpopulations, and there's some degree of migration. Third, if migration is high, the set of populations will be one large population. And for physical separation of patches, we'll kind of dive into that a little bit deeper later on. And models are based on the persistence and existence of patches, not numbers of individuals within patches. And then 6, regional or landscape scales. To give some background, metapopulations was coined by Richard Levins in 1969 to describe a model of population dynamics of insect pests in agricultural fields, but this idea has been most broadly applied to species in naturally and artificially fragmented habitats. And one of these examples of metapopulations that we can most identify with are monarch butterflies as they travel from Mexico to Canada, but it's not the same butterfly that is traversing that entire journey. And there are smaller communities within the species that are going to be impacted by different environments. So there may be a group of monarch butterflies that go through Texas all the way to Minnesota, where there may be others that go from Texas to Florida all the way to New York. So those will be different communities that are going to be impacted by different environments, different toxins or plant species that are available. So those are kind of the subpopulations that may occur within this journey. Another example of this could be a fish that's enclosed in a lake, but maybe it lost access to a river or stream due to a drought. Now that's going to be closed off from that stream. There's going to be a different environment, a different set of food sources and resources that they can utilize. So there may be a different subset of populations that kind of come through within that area. Another great example would be sheep in the backcountry or in the remote mountains. Since they are in the remote areas, that population will be segmented off versus other areas where there may be connection points where it's more of a communal spot for populations to engross in. The best way for us to relate to metapopulations to humans is to think about our cousins or our grandparents or our aunts. I can live in Denver, Colorado, but my grandpa can live in New York. We are still from the same species and the same family, but we are both experiencing different environments and different exposures as to how we can have different populations in our area and how we could potentially repopulate in those within different types of barriers and resources allotted to us. So there are different types of metapopulations, and these different types of populations are based off of different modules to view migration and recolonization. And so this will come across as different patches, so to speak. And each case of these demonstrations have a different range of variation in those migration patterns. And each of these lines indicate some sort of migration, and dashed lines outline an indication of a high migration, and hollow circles indicate unoccupied patches. So where people, where different species can kind of commune at different points in time. There are different types of metapopulations. There are 4 models that we'll be speaking about today. One of the classic ones, based off of Richard Levin's theory about fragmented habitats, and these different types of metapopulations that can occur are based off of the small subpopulations within a metapopulations that are extinct prone. So this, but they are close enough to neighboring populations for recolonization to occur. So say within the example that we had with the fish in the stream and drought, maybe a couple days later, there's a huge rainstorm that comes in, and now they have access back to the stream. That would be a place for them to have neighboring populations to then have recolonization occur, because they would then have access to that community yet again. So there are unoccupied and occupied patches within this metapopulations model. Another one would be the patchy metapopulation model, where there are enough individuals that are migrating between subpopulations that are not at risk at going extinct, but they are able to, because they are closely linked, that they are not independent of each other. But if a subpopulation were to go extinct, it would not be noticed because of how much there's a large continuous metapopulation being surrounded by that. So think more so of the monarch butterflies as they're traversing from Texas to Canada. They are currently on the endangered species list, but in the context of this model, it'd be as though they're going from Houston to, say, Minneapolis versus maybe New Orleans to Minneapolis. They're very close by each other as a matter of distance. They could then, and you wouldn't notice them as much or a decrease in their species from one city to the next, depending on how we currently view that population, and they're not at risk of going extinct in that particular barrier of model or concept of model. With a non-equilibrium metapopulation model, each of these subpopulations acts as a separate metapopulation, and they are extinct prone because of its isolation and its small size. So think back to the example of a remote sheep. They wouldn't have any access to another subpopulation to then either mate with or repopulate with or have a recolonization of their own species. Therefore, they would most likely go extinct in this particular model. And this is because they are completely independent and their demographics are not linked to other areas to have these subpopulations to then re-engage with. And then the 4th model would be the mainland island metapopulation model. This is where there are a system of patches that are near a main island patch. So think of a subpopulation that's near a larger group or population that they can then intermix and mingle with, and thus they would never go extinct. And it does not necessarily have a metapopulation within that mainland area, because they would be the one that has all of the smaller patches that would then be segmented off into subpopulations if they were to ever leave, or if there were other barriers, natural disaster, or otherwise that would come in. With all of the impacts from metapopulations and subpopulations, it could possibly be due to habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation occurs when parts of a habitat is destroyed, leaving behind smaller unconnected areas. This can occur naturally as a result of a fire or volcano, or it could result of a human activity. For instance, one more of an impertinent political side happening in the United States would be whether or not to create a wall at the border of the United States and Mexico that would create a barrier between different types of metapopulations and subpopulations for animals and plants and other species to interact with, causing habitat fragmentation. We can also view this in our everyday lives through a construction of the road through a woodland. Typically, we'll see this impacting humans more often if we were ever hit by a deer, based off of how we've created and constructed roads, because that goes right through their own habitats. Also exposing them to large animals to heavy hunting pressures and poaching can cause them to shift and navigate in different waters or different areas within their mainlands, and then seeing sedimentation of rivers from erosion. And some of the destruction of this habitat leaves species with less and less space to find everything that they need to survive, and that's why they'll have different areas, or we'll see them in different areas that we haven't typically seen them before. And these fragmented habitats are often lower in quality, as it's known as the edge effect, as these habitats are broken into these smaller and smaller pieces for these sections for them to engage with. So the proportions of these edges is where one habitat meets another, and those edges then can increase over time. So that's where they'll then typically move to, or you'll see kind of a shift into. So these types of fragmentations do limit wildlife's mobility, as these individuals struggle to move between habitat patches, which unfortunately can lead to a lot of inbreeding and a lot of loss of genetic diversity. And I think we're seeing the effects of that now, as there has been a decrease in biodiversity among different species that we're seeing within animals and plants, and then the interaction between the two, which is unfortunate, but there's hope. These are my references. Lots of them come from .edus. Try to focus mostly on academia and giving researchers that are doing this work the shout outs that they need, and should kind of uplift people that are doing the work based off of all of the research that they've put in, and thank them for all that they've done. And I don't own any of the rights to the photos. They are beautiful, but they are not mine, unfortunately. So please feel free to support the photographers that took those photos. And thank you. Feel free to contact me on Instagram, email, YouTube, or LinkedIn. My Instagram is Pursuit of Happiness. INès FRAZIER should be the name tag. My email, it's Inès@farmersfootprint.us. Feel free to contact me there. And my YouTube, I did a TED Talk last year on food sovereignty. You can learn more about my story as to why I'm in agriculture, the work that I'm doing, and kind of some pinpoints along the way. And then if you'd like to connect on a more professional level, feel free to check out LinkedIn, and that will be INès FRAZIER. And thank you all for your time today.